Okay, Michael. So, as you know, what we're doing is this film is about the social history.
Right, yeah.
Just maybe throw your mind back to when you were a child.
Yes.
And what was your Tramore like?
Yeah, okay. Will I start, yeah? My memories would be, we'll say, of the early 60s, where everything was concentrated on the Strand, swimming. And then you progressed eventually after your family, you were growing up a little bit, maybe 14, 15, and you were supposed to go then to the pier. The pier was the next progression from being a baby on the Strand. And then after that, then Newtown Cove and the Gillamine. And if you swam on the Strand when you were 15 or 16, you weren't regarded as a swimmer. You were still with your family, in other words, yeah. But we used to have great times. Up to 10 o'clock mass in the morning, every morning, or what used to take place at that time was side altars. Priests from other venues used to come and stay here further up the town, and they'd stay for a few months in the summer, and they'd have a side altar mass at maybe 9 o'clock, 9:30, before the 10 o'clock mass, the official mass. So we used to try and get up and get a side altar. And then sometimes as you got a little bit older, you told your parents you got the side altar, but you were down in 5 minutes, or you were down the back messing. So then down the Strand straight away with my aunt, who used to come down for the whole summer, and her family. And we'd be down there all day when we were that age. And as I say, then progressed to the other places. Football was another great thing. Always playing on the Strand. We did play officially for Tramore at various levels, age groups, but the real thing was the game on the Strand. Could be 20 a side, and the way it was done was everybody who arrived, usually about 11:15, I usually had the ball because I was the nearest to the Strand, so the lads would come and collect it if I couldn't go down. And you'd line up against the prom wall at the men's slip, and the team would be picked by two maybe more senior fellas who were playing on the senior team. And down with the goalpost, either a jumper, a trousers or whatever, or the sand in a build it up like a castle. And someone was stuck on goal as usual, which was what you didn't want. But anyway, so the matches start about 11:30, and then people would arrive as the day was going on, as the morning was going on, and they'd know instinctively that they'd look around and say, who am I with? And one of the lads would say, you're with us because we've won less, whatever. So that was worked out that way. And the match went on then till about maybe, I'd say about 1:45. And then it would end then, whatever. Out in the tide then, a number of the lads would go out in their jeans because they wouldn't have any togs with them and lie on the men's slip, dry out in this type of weather, and back home. And then we'll say you might be playing in the afternoon for Tramore in an official match, and you were questioned as to how you were absolutely banjacks by the time it came to 3 o'clock. So that was okay. You were lucky if the match was Sunday, because at least you had the night to get over the fact of playing down below. I think there was more effort put in sometimes down on the Strand than there was to the official match. So Sunday came then in the winter time. Everything was concentrated in Kilcone, where the Greyhound track is now, where Waterford played in the soccer. And you made a beeline at 3 o'clock, in before 3 o'clock for whoever they were playing, Shamrock Rovers, Dundalk, whatever. And sometimes then you might travel away with a few of the lads to Dalymount, wherever, that type of thing. Or you could be going to, say, Cork, down to Flower Lodge. Some of the big games took place there. And Waterford were to the fore at that stage, won 6 leagues, so they had a very, very good team. It was interspersed with a few people from England, a few of the lads they signed from England. Like, say, Peter Thomas, the goalkeeper, Johnny Matthews, the winger, Jimmy McGeough from Northern Ireland, players like that which made the team better. So at the end of that then you were back home, win or lose, you were back home. And then it was the cinema. So we had the Rex cinema below and the local cinema. We didn't have to go to Waterford. We had no transport really anyway. Nobody went in then unless you were actually going to the pictures in Waterford, which was a big thing. So then what was introduced was in the summer was the 6 o'clock picture, which was usually either a western or maybe an adventure film. So you had the list up in the window in the Rex, and you looked at what was on, and we used to go down to the 6 o'clock picture, which was over maybe about 8 o'clock. So in our case here, before the garage was extended, my mother had a big rhubarb patches, everything, apples growing, a garden. It was really extended up this way. So we used to come up and we had bows and arrows, and we'd shoot the rhubarb sticks with holes, reenacting the film if it was a western we saw below. And my mother used to think it was some unusual activity with the rhubarb, could never figure out what actually was putting holes in the rhubarb. That type of thing went on. But that was my memories of sort of growing up, you know. Everything was concentrated on swimming, football was everything. And that was it.
Your family had the garage?
Yes, yeah.
So was that, when you were born, did you have the garage?
No, the garage, no, it was built before I was born. Yeah, yeah. It was built in about 1948 by my father and by his brother. Yeah. And
where did they come from, the Rahers?
out and around the Dunhill area. All the family were in that area. But my mother was from Skibbereen in Cork. And her sister then lived in Dublin, you see. And my mother was in the civil service. But of course in the civil service in those days, when you got married, you had to give it up, unlike today. But when my father died and the garage was sold in 1967, my mother went back into the civil service. So we had to go to Dublin for a while because a relocation of school. And then it was decided that I'd go into school in Waterford. After doing the junior cert, was the inter cert as it was then, in Tramore. And the problem was that in that particular year there were only about maybe 11 or 12 of us were in the actual, would have been going into the leaving cert. And they lost the leaving cert due to lack of numbers in Tramore. So we had to be put into the schools in Waterford, and we went to Waterpark. But I never had a great love for rugby. A few of the lads had that I went to school with. But I was always in trouble because my knee was giving me trouble for years. And I used to get some stick. I was kept in a few times when you were supposed to be out rugby training. But we saw you playing soccer at lunchtime in the yard, was always the question. So you were in trouble. But that was it, more or less. Then we were up around 17 or 18 then. And then again it was the same thing, football the whole time, you know.
And your mum, what was her maiden name?
Hanway, yeah.
And where did she and your dad meet?
Oh, I would have said down in this area because they came down from Dublin, you see, all being related, you know. They had other relations out there in Dunhill as well. So everything was out there, you know, in that area. But it was just sad when the place was sold because we were left in, you know, a bit of limbo, you know, and then the garage had a kind of checkered career. It had been a garage, it was a furniture centre, carpet place, a coal yard, and now it's the Sue Rider, you know.
And were you all then, did you all learn about cars and all that?
Well, you had an interest in it. I was too young, you see. You're only about 15, you see. You know what I'm saying, when that happened. So I always had a keen interest in cars, but the mechanics, the other thing too was that the way it was in those days, you see, the religion was way bigger than it is now. After dinner, when everybody had come in, including my cousins, my mother would do the dinner, did the books in the garage in the afternoon. Father worked as a mechanic, his brother helped him. Then we had other various fellas there as, you know, training and whatever. And the rosary, the minute that the dinner was over, which would be about maybe 20 to 2, the dinner was from 1 to 2, and as Neil Tobin said, when the common people of Ireland had their dinner between 1 and 2, not in the evening as it is now, down on your knees, and you would give out the decade of the rosary. And you'd want to know it, and the various mysteries and the whole lot. So if it was your turn, then the next decade was the next person kneeling down, and that was every day without fail. Yeah, and then out to the garage, and we'd be off then over to the pier. The pier was another great swimming venue, because if you didn't get over to the pier, we'll say by early afternoon, you know the way the pier is when you drive down. I'm talking the boat pier now, not Newtown Cove. Near the Ritz there. You'd have to go back to the first steps, which was a no-no, because everyone went out to where the storm wall was at the very end, because they were diving off the wall and hopping off things, swimming across. Some of them would swim to the strand and back. And that was the place to be. So we were still that bit young, you know, and that's where we really kind of learned to swim as well, in deeper water than the strand, because you wouldn't be allowed to go out over your depth down below. As a young person, you know, obviously. But that was it, more or less, you know.
Did you remember when they started to do surfing?
Oh, yeah, because Catherine's brother Dick, now, he was into that. Dave Kenny, the dentist that retired there recently, there was a load of them there, you know. that were involved in it. Some of the lads from town that used to congregate. See, when we were younger and we used to go over there was always the older generation there that were there, who used to hang around down around. That was another great thing, you see. We were always told, don't ever be going into the amusements because it'll cost you a fortune. So we as locals knew that, whereas people who were on holidays to spend every penny they had down there. That's why they became so wealthy. But anyway, our thing was hanging around the jukebox with 2 plays, 4 plays for a shilling and that kind of thing, 2 plays for sixpence, you know, whatever it was. All the records. So we used to hang around there. But the older fellas would go down in the night time, you see. We'd be home. And when they'd be missing then maybe till 10 or 11 o'clock. But it was pretty strict at the same time. Your parents would make sure that you were home, you know.
And there was always good selection of music in those jukeboxes.
Brilliant. Every single that was out, because I was in a printing place before I joined the Munster Express, and we used to print the record labels there. Joe Dolan, Make Me an Island, we printed thousands of that because it was a big hit. I think he got to about number 5 or 6 in England at the time. Saw him on Top of the Pops, very good. And all the Irish things we did, you know, we did a lot of the different labels. So they were printed, punched out, drilled, and then they had to be brought over to the train at the station to be in Dublin for that night for pressing. And so sometimes we get an odd copy from the local man who used to, you know, be up and down there.
And what about did you ever go to the Atlantic?
Well, you see, we were too young when it was in its heyday. But what we used to notice was, we'll say if a fella, not many fellas that have a tie in those days, well, you had to kind of be well dressed when you were going in. You wouldn't get in jeans or anything like that then. So they used to pass the ties out through the windows. When those windows that you see that were in the Atlantic before it was done up, they'd pass the tie out the window to another fella and he'd get in then as well, you know. Yeah. But it was, what we used to love was they used to print the cards of the bands, so we used to collect those. You'd have, say, maybe Dickie Rock and the Miami, the Savoy, Brendan O'Brien and the Dixies, what's the girl, remember, with the big beehive, Eileen Reid and the Cadets, all those groups used to play there. And then the 15th of August, of course, was a massive day. You'd have a very big band there on that night. Not Joe Loss, but that type of stuff, you know, would be there. And it would be thronged. You couldn't get a room to move down there. But that's all changed now. That's all gone.
And like when you were young, did you keep pigeons?
Yes, kept pigeons, yeah.
So, because like the present generation wouldn't know what you're doing.
Well, now, in all fairness to, I only spoke to a few lads recently, it's a big thing now, but the regulations became with vaccinations and that when the fowl pest thing, you remember that came in? You see, they had to be vaccinated. I was kind of gone out of it at that stage. It used to be known pigeon racing as the poor man's racehorse. But I can tell you, as time went on, it became more expensive. The grain, the good grain to feed them properly, became expensive. It was imported. It was all dusted off, you know, cleaned and everything. We used to collect it in New Ross from one of the local fanciers who had a kind of, you know, he used to keep the bags of it there. So we drive down to New Ross to get it. But it became, even then, you see, the petrol went up. I mean, I often used to leave work down at Grattan Quay out by the bridge, and I'd have the pigeons in the basket since lunchtime. I'd come out for my lunch at 1 o'clock. At those days, you could get to Newtown Cove, clock out at 1 o'clock, bring your togs and towel in the car. 3 or 4 of us would head out to Newtown, have a swim, be back in, and clocked in for about 5 to 2. And then we wouldn't bother. We might bring a sandwich with us or whatever. You wouldn't get down as far as Bunkers Hill now in that time of time. There was no cars on the road, you see, you know. But the pigeon racing, it became very, very expensive after. But there still are a number of lads at it, all right, you know.
Just explain to people how it works, because some people wouldn't know.
It works by a magnetic draw to the pigeons, have a magnetic field that they go by. That's why when a lot of this mobile phone stuff and all came in, they used to put it down that it would put them off. But weather played a big part in it as well. You brought them up as young birds. You might have had maybe 30 or 40 old birds, and you'd breed maybe in May or early or even April, May. You would have two young birds with what each pair would breed. And they'd maybe breed, you could let them breed, say, 3 times a year. Otherwise, you take the eggs away. When they came out, you got a ring which had from the Irish Home Union. It had a number on it, and it was put on the leg of the pigeon when the toes were really small after about 10 days. Before the leg grew, you couldn't get the ring on then. So that was done, and then when it came to race day, well, you used to train them first. And what you did with young birds was you brought them in the road in the basket, we'll say, into Waterford. You let them out, and their instinct brought them home. You had a problem maybe getting them in or, whatever, because they wouldn't be used to it. But as time went by, they would then familiarise themselves. You'd go further, Thomastown. I often drove up to Carlow into Kildare before the light was gone, let them out, and they'd be home before you. Then you'd come home and you'd feed them. Well, you'd have feed in it anyway, or somebody'd be here to let them in and close the loft, because, of course, cats were a danger, So as they got older, then the longer races. The longest race for a young bird would be, say, maybe Ballycastle in Northern Ireland. At the end of the season, that would be the longest race. Young birds really didn't go out of the country, but the old birds did. Thurso in Scotland would have been the furthest northerly point. Because us being in the southern part of the country, we flew the northern road, whereas the Dublin lads and fellas in Belfast flew the southern road and came out of England and France. And we went the other way up towards... Then Fraserburgh in Scotland was another one. So the courier, you bring your birds in to get them marked, and a rubber ring was put on the other leg. It had a hidden number. You had your clock at home. The convoyer of the lorry, all the birds would be basketed, put into the lorry, and then he'd drive up, we'll say, they'd be basketed for a longer race on Thursday night. And the race would be Saturday morning, weather permitting. So when he, of course, communication being in its infancy as such, no mobile phones in those days, his job would be to ring back to one dedicated number, one of the fanciers, and he would say, right, conditions look good tomorrow morning, I'm letting them go at 6 o'clock. So you knew then the time, and then when the bird came home, if you were lucky to get one at that distance within good time, you got it into the shed, into your loft, and then you caught the bird, not to annoy it. You just did it really gently, as quick as you could, obviously, because time was of the essence. And you took the rubber ring off its leg, and you put it into a thimble that dropped into the clock. And you turned the handle, and it registered on a spool of paper the time, everything, right down to the second. So the clocks then were locked once you did that. There was a seal put on them originally when they were all set in somebody's house or other. And then when the clock was brought into Waterford, which was the centre around St. John's there, the clocks were opened, and the winner then would have been made out by velocity and the distance, of course, and all, with latitude and longitude, all were made out. The points were all made out anyway, available from the different race points, and that's the way the winner was announced. But there became big money. There was big money in it in, say, Dublin and in Northern Ireland, where they were really into it. And if you won a federation then, you could be winning, at that time, a couple of £100, then birds became expensive. The Massarella brothers in England used to supply birds to the Queen. She had a loft at Sandringham, because there was the King George the Sixth, I think it was, Cup that they used to race for. And there was always a racing loft in Sandringham in England, But they had no problem buying the best of stock, from the good breeders. But that was it, more or less, It was a hobby, but as I say, it became expensive.
And did you ever have a good race?
I had a few. I had won the young bird average 3 years in a row, which would have been, say, averaged out over a season. We'd say however many races it was, and I won that 3 years in a row. Yeah. And never had a great success with the old birds, but I kind of was, we'll say, getting out of it at that stage then too, and it was a much more difficult thing to win the old birds, because the distances were far greater. You were up against all kinds of weather conditions. Sometimes there'd be trouble, say, if it was decided that the weather changed, and the courier would be blamed for letting them go, not hold them till Sunday. But then the problem was with fellas working, you see. If the bird came home Monday or Tuesday, which a race was often won the day next day or the day after on the longer races, a fella'd be at work. So he'd have trying to get someone to clock it in other words. It was more difficult. But it was a lot more difficult that way,
And And you know, to back to when you were a young fella,
Mm.
what, can you remember any of the older people around, like that had shops or pubs?
Oh yeah, the main street here is totally different than it was years ago. I mean, it bears no resemblance now. You had the butcher shops, Jim Welsh. You had Frank. What was his name? Frank that had the place before. You had the Bijou down there. The two ladies that ran the Bijou. Cunningham's chip shop sure was famous. People used to come from all over the place. In fact, one Sunday I was in Kilcone. And I came in a little bit late, maybe the match had started, so I was down by the railings at the front. Normally we go up in the stand if you were there early enough. So there was a group of fellas standing there, and I just said, yeah, I just raced in. I was just watching a bit of the big match with Brian Moore, which was on UTV at the time. If the reception was good coming in from 2 to 3, and you'd race in at the last minute in by Castletown School, the back road, and go in. So they were saying, oh yeah, he said, we're down from, I said, we were watching Match of the Day last night, and of course that piqued an interest with me with the television, you see. I said, where did you, because no one had the BBC really, where did you see it? Oh, down in Connolly's, they said. Connolly's had it as well, you see, below us here. All right, I said, yeah, what we do, he said, is we ring Connolly's, he said, at about maybe 9 o'clock or so. We're up and down Garvin, and if the reception is coming in, 4 or 5 of us pile into the car and we come down, watch Match of the Day, straight over to Cunningham's then for a feed of chips and back home again. I said, that's a good one, all right. I said, yeah. And they were from Dungarvan.
And that was the thing about Tramore, is that you could get the BBC.
You could get the BBC with fluctuating reception. I mean, a lot of the time it wouldn't be watchable, but the thrill was to see how much you could improve it by increasing aerial sizes, different types of amplifiers. That was a big thing. A big thing, yeah. And everything that I went to Mount Leinster to see the RTE fellas then to show me their setup there, you know. We went all over the country, sure, checking signals and just seeing what was going on elsewhere, you know.
Which people nowadays would find hard.
Oh, stop. I mean, they wouldn't even look at what we used to look at then, you know. Could be coming and going spots, but a lot of the time we had nothing else, you see, you know. We used to go up 2 years ago when Sadie's pub above Robinson's, just above us here. My father used to drink up there along with all the other lads who used to be there, you know. It was a different scene then. You could go in at 10:30 in the morning and there'd be a line of fellas along the counter, a cigarette in one hand, a pint in the other hand, and the paper out in front, reading the paper, all sitting along the counter. Yeah.
Oh, can you remember any names who would be there?
Oh, well, a lot of the local characters, like, you know, Tim O'Mahony. People used to arrive at the garage, you see, and a lot of people from out the country used to come in, or locals here, and they'd gather at the corner there because they'd be waiting for Sadie's to open, you see. That was the big thing. There was no track across the road then. There was no betting offices as such. There were Paddy or Power's booking office down by the post office. But like, it wasn't the same thing, you know, as now with the track up here and they're all over the place, you know, the betting offices. But the lads were all local men who were all since dead long ago, you know. But that was the thing then. There was no other real entertainment, you see. But the news then was gathered, you see, out around there, and you heard things, and even as a young lad, like. But, you know, they would have been having different types of conversations, obviously, you know. But it was good, though, you know, I remember. And actually, the other thing is, I know it's lovely today here, but to us, I don't know whether it's just your mind or whatever, but the summers definitely seem to be better. There's no doubt about it. And I'd say that without it. We used to spend hours on the strand. You go down now, go for a swim, and you're more or less coming back home, either blown out with the wind or rain or whatever, you know. Yeah.
And the other thing about technology as well was
Yeah.
We had the pirate radio station.
Yeah, that's true too, yeah.
And Tramore had one.
Yeah, over at Newtown Hill, where the Ordinaforriga nursing home, which since has closed down, that's where it was. The ABC, I think, wasn't it? Tramore ABC. And then there were a number of different variants of it around in Waterford as well, I think, and down New Rossway. But when legalisation came then, I think they did apply for the licence, or some other groups did, but WLR, of course, were selected for the licence, you know.
But ABC was kind of the station for young people.
Oh yeah, definitely. Like that Beat. I mean, in fact, on the greenhouse there, Alice still has a thing there of Beat, and that's not today or yesterday. One of the stickers they had, you know, and they used to listen to that but that was obviously years later, you know. Yeah, no, it was an interesting time, all right. No mobile phones, no communications like that.
And then the other thing about BBC and ITV as well
Yeah.
is that you'd see programs that, like for example, that you wouldn't get to see on RT?
Oh no, you wouldn't. No, because a lot of the Irish, we say on RT, a lot of the stuff that was of interest, a family type thing, was the programs like Dynasty and that type of stuff that was brought in, Hawaii 5-0, those type of things, and some of the family comedies, Father Knows Best and that type of stuff. When you see.
A bit more racy might be on BBC or RT.
Not well, in the sense of maybe some of the comedy stuff, all right, actually, yeah. Because that's a good one. Because even at the time now, Benny Hill today would have been considered fairly, okay. But in those times it was risque. So if Benny Hill or something like that came on, you were told to turn it off, without a doubt. Yeah. Oh no, that wouldn't do.
Time, wasn't it?
Oh, completely. Oh, Janie, when you see what's on now, even on social media, no, that wouldn't do at all. It was a different time.
Soccer then for Tramore? Did you play soccer for Tramore?
Yeah, for Tramore, yeah, different levels up to, senior level. Like.
What was your position?
Usually out on the wing, that's where my bad leg came, or left half, that, which would be left centre mid, or left midfield now, But everybody had a dedicated position. I mean, anyone who's of my vintage knows that a fella was a full back and that was it, and he didn't stir beyond the halfway line or even got anywhere close to it. Now they're meant to run up and down and cover all grounds and be a winger as well. Same with the centre half, he just headed the ball away and cleared it. Same thing.
You knew your role.
Oh, you knew your role, yeah, and there you go beyond it,
And you said you had a bad leg. Was that because you got crunched so much?
Yeah, a few tackles, yeah. The left knee was bad for me when I was about 15.
But wasn't that the way?
Cartilage
you
trouble.
were told as a defender to go out and crunch him?
Well, you see, that was your idea, but then again, if you had, you don't know, a fella come across you on the inside of the leg, and that's what happened to me in here. I had it done, 3 or 4 times, but it never was right, never, So that was the start of all my problems. Yeah.
No, but it's interesting because it's it was kind of more. It was hard, wasn't it? It was hard times.
It was, yeah. They were the facilities we had then weren't anything like now, but still people got on with it. And I'll tell you another thing that was a really good aspect of it was home cooking. People made mackerel, the coilies over at the pier. They sold fish off the boat on a Sunday. They used to bring in the boat. Tom Coiley, Joe, Martin, all those were out in the boat. And that was a known feature over in the pier. Their boat was always moored out at the last steps, ready to go. And my daughter, who's in Rome at the moment now, working in the UN, when she was a child, Tom used to have his cart over at the corner here where they take out off licences now on a Friday. And Elaine would go over to him, and she'd sit up on the side of the thing, and Tom would say, Elaine, will you go over and get me an ice cream and get one for yourself? And he used to sell the mackerel. They were either a sixpence or a shilling each at the time. Back then, earlier days, they had come up in price, obviously, by the time, that's what, 20, Elaine is what, 30, about maybe 25 years ago, But it was all, home cooking was the real thing. People made 3 meals, we'll say, out of fish during the week. On a Friday, always, fish was at dinner time. Mackerel, or it could be whatever you'd have, crab was another one that was used. They were, of course, more of a delicacy, and so were the other things, lobsters. Yeah, people used to fish for lobsters, But we often fished out in the boat now. I used to go out with our boat was commonly owned by about 3 or 4 business people here of different, maybe not really of persuasion of fishing, but they all just joined in. And Thursday was the half day in Tramore. And the place closed down. You worked on a Saturday then, of course, not like now as such. But out in the boat then, every Thursday. So any fish then, we put back into the car, up the slipway, back home to the garage. The garage would be opened up, and the lads from Sadie's would come down, and they used to hand them out maybe half a dozen, and they wouldn't charge anything. Yeah. So.
Which would be perfect for Friday.
Oh, perfect, but they'd be cleaned out by the woman of the house or whatever, beheaded, tailed, split open, done on the bone, sometimes flat on the pan. Oh, I tell you, beautiful, with tomatoes or whatever was there. There was no bought-in stuff then. Everything was, natural food. And people say, I know people live longer today, but I tell you, some of the people you'd know, they were still up in their 90s, 80s and 90s and didn't do any harm or real butter either, you know. So I don't know really, you know. It's a bit of a mystery, you know. But that was the way it was, and any produce you had in the garden, rhubarb, vegetables, were all used, you know, carrots, everything. It was a different life, a completely different life. You couldn't go over to Super Value like you did then, like you can now, and buy a box of this and a box of that and just put it in the microwave. You didn't have one, you know.
And then what about people paying in the garage? Do they?
Well, like that would be done. You would have a bill like for people who would be regulars, and you know, fix up maybe the end of the month and all that. But that was always again, you know, you'd be hoping people to pay the bills, the same as anything, you know. A lot of problems then were, say, breakdowns with maybe dampness, you know, that sort of stuff with cars when coils on them weren't as good as they are now, and obviously they weren't as reliable as now, you know. But that's mostly fixing punctures was another thing, vulcanising tubes, putting patches on the tyres, you know. And the other thing we used to use over in the pier was, which we always had an availability of, was a tyre for your ring out in the water. We used to bring over a tractor tyre, a big one, and you know, there'd be maybe 20 patches on it after being vulcanised. Would be one that was going to be dumped, but it was still operational. So you'd fling it in off the top of the pier, then dive into it, go through it, or come up under it, and this sort of thing, you know. Yeah, brilliant, yeah. That's like, it was so simple. Everything was simple, you know. Go over on the bicycles or walk over. And you come home in the evening then for your tea. You had to be home, of course, in those days. You had to be there at 1 o'clock and you had to be there at 6 o'clock. And if you were missing, there'd be an inquiry as to why you were late. It didn't go down well if everybody wasn't around the table, you know. But everybody had enough, you know. Even there could be 7 or 8 for dinner, could be more.
And where did boys and girls meet then? Was it down the
Usually down around the front, yeah, really. I'd say that's probably where it was. A different story now, of course, with the nightclubs and all that. They weren't then. And at the dances, of course. Silver Slipper down there, which is now where Tony or Bobby O'Reilly and them have the places, you know, morning. And then, of course, inside in Waterford as well, you know, as you got older. But that would be up when you were, 18, 19. You see, nobody drank either, you know, before they were maybe 21 back then. That's a whole different ball game now, you know. I mean, you wouldn't have the money. You'd be lucky if you had 2 shillings, you know. If you got, say, I remember one of the priests used to come here and I used to fill him up with petrol or whatever. He'd put 10 shillings in it, he'd say, which was a lot of money then. Do the tyres, the water and all, and he'd always give me a half-crown. Now 2 and 6 in those days was handy, you know. You wouldn't get that very often, I can tell you. And Honda 50s, the seat used to go up and you'd no sooner have the nozzle into the thing than to be full. Shillings worth. 80 miles to the gallon out of the Honda 50, yeah. And they're like gold dust now, if you had them in good order, you know. Same with the vintage cars, of course, a lot of them, you know. But we had, I remember one occasion, the rally, as you were talking about there, of English people came to Tramore, and of course the Grand in those days was the big place to stay. When they had Jimmy Kane used to be outside with his dicky bow white starched white shirt, and you know, meeting people, bringing in the gear. But these people came and they had to garage their cars. So our bungalow wasn't there then, so they were all washed out there because you could come out that way through the side of the garage. But all the cars were kept that night up here for, I think it was, one night. And they came up then in the morning at about 6 o'clock to fill them up with petrol. They were going on then further. It was like a tour around Ireland. But you saw some beautiful cars, Rileys, you know, this sort of stuff that you wouldn't see normally around the town. Like, very few people had cars in those days. We had a taxi man, Roddy Crane, across the road there above Cunningham's. We had Paddy Welsh on this side, who was again taxi. Freddie Fitzgerald down on Patrick Street. That'll tell you that even then, like, a lot of people hadn't got cars or the availability of them. So taxis were used, like. But that was it, you know. Yeah.
Michael, that's great. Thanks very much.
Not at all, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
That's really useful.
Yeah. Well, you might get some snippets out of it anyway, you know. I could say a lot more now, but I don't want to be.
That's always was the way.
Yeah, well, no, you see, I know that. Look, I can picture it. I don't want to include people that might have something else to say if they saw me face to face, if you know what I mean. There would be a number of things now that I could bring up if it was not being, let's say, broadcast or whatever, you know, in private.
Keep that for the Pope.
What?
Keep that for the Pope.
Well, that's what I'm saying, you know, that kind of thing, you know.
Thanks,
I'll
Ian.
stop.